Hello guys, welcome to Cotech. In today's video, we're going to learn about Keycloak, its integration with Spring Boot application using Spring Security. The agenda of today's video is going to be, we're going to see what a Keycloak is. We're going to set up the Keycloak server, configure relevant roles and users. We're going to build an auth server in Spring Boot app and integrate Keycloak using Spring Security. And lastly, we're going to implement the login and logout feature. So let's see what a Keycloak is. It is an open source software product which provides identity and access management. Pretty straightforward statement, but we'll just see a little more deeper. So previously, we developers had to develop our own user management infrastructure. That is the login feature, logout, password reset, password hashing, and if social login feature is required, we had to add additional code to it, which again increased the complexity. However, thanks to frameworks like Keycloak, which has made the developer's life so much easier by offloading these kind of authentication code from the application. So now we can just focus on the complex business logic rather than this authentication part. Let's look at some of the features. Provides single sign-in. So users authenticate with a Keycloak rather than individual applications. So users have to just log in once. They don't have to again log in to access any other application. So this is applicable to logout as well. So once the users are logged out of Keycloak, they will be logged out from all the applications that use Keycloak. Provides support for OpenID, SAML, and Auth2. Provides support for login with social networks. It has a built-in support to connect to existing LDAP server or Active Directory servers. We can also provide implementation of our own data store. And this is most important. That is the new version of Keycloak. It supports only RDBMS. So Keycloak no longer supports NoSQL. And we have some client adapters which is available for JavaScript applications, Tomcat, Jetty, and Spring, which makes the configuration or which makes the usage of Keycloak within a Spring Boot a lot more easier. Let's see some of the core concepts of Keycloak just to summarize the features that we just saw in the previous slide. So Keycloak provides the support for this identity provider, that is OpenID Connect, SAML, and any social login that's required. So we don't have to additionally code in our application for this. It's just a matter of configuration from the admin console. And once we log in to the Keycloak, there will be a default realm that is created for us. And within the realm, we can create the users, roles, clients, and the user federation, where we can leverage the Keycloak's feature to connect to an existing LDAP server or also provide an implementation to connect to any other data store if the users are present elsewhere. Let's move on to setting up the Keycloak server. We can download it from its official page. You can download the zip or the tar file, and once downloaded, open a terminal in its bin folder. I'm in the bin folder of Keycloak. You have to run this command. You can provide a port number here. By default, Keycloak runs on 8080 port, but you might be having other applications running on 8080. So I'm giving a different port number. Our Keycloak server is up. Go to your browser and type localhost 8180. We need to create a admin user. Go to the administration console. You can log in with the admin credentials that you just created. Here you can see that the default realm is already created for you. But let's create a realm for our application. I named it auth realm create. This realm has been created. Let's create a client, giving the name as auth client. Save. There are some settings here. Giving the access type of confidential. Flow is off. So account enabled. And save it. So now the client is created. If you go to the credentials, you can see that the client secret is auto-generated by Keycloak. Let's create users. Add credentials for the user. Let me add another user. Add credentials for that user as well. Okay, so we have created two users, Max and Mike. Now let me create roles. Let's create an admin role. And one more role we can create, maybe a user role. Go to users, go to Max, go to role mappings. Of Max, let's give him an admin access. Okay. Go to users again, go to Mike, role mapping. Let's give Mike a user role. So what we did so far, we created a realm. Realm is a logical grouping of clients, users, roles. So users of one realm will not be available in another realm. And then we created client. Client is an application which connects to this Keycloak server. So we created the client ID and we got the auto-generated client secret. And then we created some users, roles, and mapped the roles to the users. Let's now create a Spring Boot project and integrate Keycloak to it. I've opened Spring Initializer. Artifact, let's give it as auth server. Dependencies, let's add web and security. We also need Auth2 client. Okay. generate. So after generating, unzip it, open it in your IDE. So here I've imported the auth server project to my STS IDE. Let me open the pom.xml. So here you can see the auth client, Spring Boot security, and the web dependency added. We need to add the Keycloak dependency as well as the adapter for Keycloak. Let me do that quickly. So I've added the Keycloak dependency and the adapter dependency. So once done, you have don't forget to update the Maven project forcefully in order to download all the dependencies. Okay, so once all this is done, we are good to go. Let's see the token endpoint of Keycloak. So log into the Keycloak. Go to Realm Settings. Here you can see the endpoints, OpenID endpoint configuration. Click on it. And here you can see this token endpoint. Right, so let's copy this. Let's use Postman. In the body, we need to give the client ID, client secret, grant type, username, password. Client ID, the one that we created. We created auth client. So this is our client ID. Client secret, again from the credentials tab, the auto-generated client secret. Grant type, we're going to use password. Let me give the username as Max, password also as Max. Change the request method as post and send it. So you can see we have got the access token and the refresh token and also the expiry time. Let's copy the access token and let's see in the JWT decoder. So you see in the payload, we can see the roles, admin role that we had given for Max and the username and the email that we had provided. Okay, we also have the client ID. So let's move on with the implementation part. So what we're going to do is we're going to provide a login endpoint which is going to act as a wrapper around the token endpoint provided by Keycloak. So why we're doing this is when it comes to building a full-fledged application, it is ideal to have such an architecture so that we can provide routing path from the API gateway and also provides a seamless integration from the front-end application. So let's start by creating the packages. Inside the controller, let's create a class, login controller. Integrating with REST controller and request mapping. So here let's have one post method. This is going to be /login. Login request, let it take. Oh, sorry, response rate. Let me create the model of this. Login response. Fine. We'll create a login response under the model package. And we'll also create login request class. So login request is going to take username and password. For login response class, we need the access token, refresh token, and their expiry time. We need to have a service class. Let's auto wire that. Login service. Login service dot login. Pass the login request. Let's create the service. Create a class login service under the service package. Annotate with service. And let's create the login method. So from this method, we'll be making a REST call to the token endpoint of Keycloak. So let's prepare the request body for that. We'll be creating a map where key is string, value is string, and we'll be passing all the necessary fields required. That is the client ID, client secret, grant type, username, and password. Now we have to make a REST call. For that, we need a REST template to be created. So let's create a bean for that. Let's do it here. So to wire that. To do a post for entity, we need to pass the URL, the login request, and what is the class type of the response. So the URL is going to be this one. Okay, and the login request is this one. HTTP entity, and the response is going to be a login response. Login response dot class. Let's return this response. Okay, now we need to get these values. So let's get them from the application.properties file. First thing, let's add the server port. 9000 will give it. So these are the properties that we need to add to an application.properties file. All these are coming from the Spring Security. So client ID, we get it from the Keycloak, all these details. Client ID, client secret, authorization grant type, we're giving it as password. The provider is Keycloak, issuer URI, token URI. So these things again you can get it from the Keycloak admin console, where we open the realm settings and click on the OpenID endpoint configuration. So the issuer endpoint is this token endpoint. So with the issuer, Spring can get the other endpoint details. Okay, so we just have to provide this. We don't even have to give the token endpoint. So let's see how we can use it in our service class. So here I'm creating all the necessary variables, the client ID, client secret, issue URL, grant type, and using the at value annotation, let's pick its value from the application.properties file. Let's add these values into the map. So this username and password will be coming from the login request. Get username. We need to add a configuration. So let's create a class and the config package, security config. I'm annotating this with Keycloak configuration. Okay. So let's override some of the methods. So this is a session authentication strategy. If it's a public application with a user interaction, then we can give a register session authentication strategy. If it is a service to service application, we can use a null authentication strategy. So I'll anyway give a register session authentication strategy session. You also need this configure. So anything that's coming with the auth permit all, don't want to authorize those requests. And we also have to tell Spring that now our authentication manager is going to be the Keycloak authentication provider. So for that, I've added this method. So we are creating an Keycloak authentication provider and giving it to the authentication manager builder. Now, while doing so, we need to add uh, the Keycloak properties in our application.properties file. We need to give the realm details. So we need to provide this. We need to give the realm name. Resource is the client name, and auth server URL. So out of this, these are the mandatory parameters. I'm creating another config file specific to Keycloak. Keycloak config. This is a configuration class wherein we have to tell Spring Boot to pick the Keycloak configuration from the application.properties file or application.yml file and not from any other external location. So let's test this endpoint. Start the auth server. It's up on port 9000. Let's go to Postman and hit the request. HTTP localhost 9000 /auth/login. And it's a post request. In the body, we got to pass the username and password. Username giving Max. Password is also Max. So we have got the response correctly. Got the access token, refresh token, and their expiry. So in the similar way, we can also provide a logout endpoint, which is going to internally call the Keycloak's logout. So let's do that. It's again going to be another post mapping. I'm going to create a class token request under model package. So this is going to accept one string token. So we need the same thing. We need to create the body of this. So I will just copy the same thing. But what we need to add in the map is going to change. We don't need the grant type. We don't need username password. Rather, we need only the refresh token. And this refresh token, we can get it from the request. Okay, that's something. Okay, and the URL that we are going to call is end session endpoint. Let me create a class in the model for the response. I create it as response. So here I just need one message. Let's test this. Let me give this as token. Okay. So HTTP localhost 9000/auth/logout. Post request, and in the body going to pass the token. So for logout, we need to pass the refresh token. got the message logged out successfully. It's perfectly fine. But how to be sure of this? So once logged out, the token must be in an inactive state, right? So we have another endpoint by Keycloak, which is the introspect token. Let's use that. Now we are going to provide an introspect endpoint, which is going to call the Keycloak's introspection endpoint. Okay, so this URL or this endpoint is going to say if the token is active or not. So again, this is going to be a post mapping, which will be taking a token as the body. So here we don't need refresh token. We need to pass a token only. This will be request, and this URL is going to be the introspection URL. Let me create a class in the model for introspection response. Here I need one Boolean variable, which is going to say whether it's active or not. Alright, so let's test this. Localhost 9000 /auth/introspect. Again, it's a post mapping. In the body, we have to give the token. So let me send this again. Let's take the access token. Giving the access token in the body. Send. It's active. Awesome. Now let me take the refresh token. In the logout endpoint, in the body, let me paste it. Send. I got the response. It's logged out successfully. Now with the same access token, let me hit the introspect. It is false. So the flow is clear. After logout, the token has got invalidated. So to summarize what we did, we created three endpoints: login, logout, and introspect. The login endpoint takes the username and password in the request and it generates the access token, refresh token. The logout will take the refresh token in the request and it invalidates the token. Introspect endpoint is again, it's going to take the token as the request and it's going to say whether that token is active or not. So what we are going to see in the next video is we're going to see how authorization works with Keycloak. In this video, we just saw the authentication part. Next, we're going to see the token relay. So what is token relay is in microservice architecture, the incoming call will be propagated to multiple resource servers. And this access token that we have received must also be sent to each of these internal microservice call. So this is called as token relay. So we'll see how that is implemented. Next, we'll see how we set up the API gateway. Thanks for watching, guys.